used its own scoreboard that you're looking at there to welcome transgender fans with messages reading things like, "Hey, trans fans, glad you're here. Go."
Never a dull moment around the WNBA. I just gotta be honest, man. This whole situation involving men playing in the league just keep getting better by the day, and it's turning into a small Netflix series, it feel like. Tell me I'm lying, because I'm just waiting on the next episode to come out, boy. I'm binge watching this all play out in front.
While players fight for fair competition, the league quietly signaled something most fans never expected: full openness to trans athletes in women's basketball. No major press conference. No real debate with the athletes who actually sweat for these spots. Just quiet policy and public statements that change everything. What they showed and what it means for the future of the women's game will shock you. This isn't opinion. This is what they put on record.
Adam should come out, and Kathy. I like both of them a lot. Women can own. There's no transgender people going to play in the WNBA. If you don't like it, kick rocks. The WNBA is for women only, period. I'm always support the gay community and the transgender, but that doesn't mean they can play sports against women, period.
What refreshing common sense.
The WNBA decided that the best way to handle growing questions about fairness in women's basketball was to light up the Jumbotron at Barclays Center with messages of support aimed specifically at trans fans, turning a professional sports arena into a floating billboard for a particular set of social priorities, while the actual competition on the court continued as if nothing fundamental was being signaled.
So the WNBA seems hell-bent on just destroying their moment, right? That they, all of a sudden, they have fans actually going to the games. They have networks willing to broadcast the games. They have salaries that are increasing largely because of Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham and a few others. And they are determined to rub the spot on the wall and make everything worse and make us talk about the WNBA and this issue over and over again. Charlemagne is right, and he's trying to give them good advice. But I have a feeling that
this move landed not as casual fan appreciation, but as a deliberate public declaration that the league had chosen a side in a debate that many athletes, coaches, and longtime followers of the sport still consider unresolved and deeply consequential for the integrity of female categories.
Got NBA legend Charles Barkley demanding the WNBA do what's right. Kathy, Adam Silver, the whole executive board need to confirm that there is no men playing in this league. They got to do what they got to do to verify that it's only women playing in this league. And as for Enes Kanter, he is not being banned. Y'all want to know why he ain't being banned? Because there is a loophole within their clause to where men could play in the league.
Instead of addressing the practical realities of strength, speed, and physiological differences that have defined sex-based divisions for decades, the organization opted for a highly visible gesture that framed any hesitation about open inclusion as a moral failing rather than a legitimate concern about competitive balance.
They want people to accept a grown man with balls that's going to play in women's sports and just accept that he a woman? No, man, I got daughters, and other fathers that got daughters agree with me. You don't want no man in women's sports. This is clown shit.
Damn right. Steven Jackson and I clearly don't always agree. I stand 10 toes down with him on that one. He's absolutely right. And by the way, he has won on every level. By the way, he is an NBA champ.
The timing and the medium made the statement impossible to ignore because Jumbotrons are not subtle tools. They are designed to dominate the visual field of thousands of people at once and to leave an impression that outlasts the final buzzer. What emerged from this display was less a celebration of hospitality and more a calculated performance that invited applause from one direction while quietly daring critics to voice dissent under the glare of institutional approval. This approach fits a broader pattern in which organizations like the WNBA shift conversations away from measurable outcomes and toward emotional framing that makes disagreement feel socially costly. When questions arise about whether male-bodied athletes retain advantages after certain transitions, the response rarely involves detailed discussion of bone density, muscle mass, lung capacity, or performance data collected over years. years of elite competition. Instead, the conversation pivots to labels that cast skeptics as intolerant or worse, effectively short-circuiting any examination of the underlying science by treating the mere act of raising the issue as evidence of bad character. The strategy works because it leverages the natural human desire to avoid being seen as unkind, transforming a policy disagreement into a purity test that many people would rather pass than challenge. In the process, the league positions itself as the enlightened guardian of inclusion while sidestepping the harder work of explaining how female athletes can continue to compete on equal footing when the category boundaries themselves become porous.
Named to Julie, pumps a bunch of hormones in his body in 2021, transitions to being a woman, and then 3 years later enters the league for women. Honestly, I don't know what's worse. People like Julian that need help or the people that enable it. WNBA, unfortunately, is a woke political machine, and I don't know why they don't just allow Julian to enter. He's the star player. He even said, if they contact me, I won't say no. And for all of these WNBA head coaches that like to enable this behavior, why don't you put your money where...
Consider the practical implications of elevating specific identity groups through arena messaging while leaving other groups without similar high-profile recognition. A jumbotron that singles out one community for explicit welcome creates an implicit hierarchy of whose presence deserves institutional spotlight and whose presence is simply assumed. This is not neutral hospitality. It is selective amplification that treats certain identities as requiring special endorsement in order to feel legitimate. The same arena could just as easily have scrolled messages affirming the hard work of every player who earned a roster spot through years of training within the existing female category. Yet that message would not have carried the same cultural cachet or generated the same media circulation. By choosing the more charged version, the league demonstrated that it understands the power of optics and is performance across every measurable metric for as long as records have been kept. Average male advantages in upper body strength, lower body power, skeletal leverage, and aerobic capacity do not vanish because an individual identifies differently, and the retention of those advantages after puberty remains a consistent finding across multiple sports and research reviews. Maintaining separate categories has therefore never been about excluding people for the sake of exclusion. It has been about creating a space where female athletes can train, compete, and achieve recognition without competing against bodies that developed under different hormonal and structural conditions.
No man should be playing in the WNBA. No man should be competing against women in female sports. We got to stop it. Men should play against men, females should play against females, and transgenders should play against transgenders. Simple. That's not being anti-trans.
When organizations reframe this straightforward recognition of material reality as an act of malice or an attempt to cause harm, they invert the actual stakes. The harm that follows from dissolving category boundaries falls primarily on the female athletes whose opportunities, scholarships, podium places, and careers become more precarious. Portraying those athletes' concerns as rooted in hatred rather than in self-preservation is a rhetorical maneuver that protects the ideology at the expense of the people the category was designed to serve. The emotional tactics employed in these situations rely heavily on the weaponization of social stigma. Critics are invited to imagine themselves as the villains in a morality play where the only acceptable role is enthusiastic affirmation, and any deviation from that script risks reputational damage. This dynamic discourages open inquiry because the cost. The resulting atmosphere is one in which compliance is mistaken for consensus and in which the loudest institutional voices can claim moral high ground without ever having to defend the practical consequences of their positions. In this environment, the WNBA's Jumbotron messages function less as invitations and more as boundary markers that indicate which opinions will be rewarded with institutional warmth and which will be met with institutional coldness.
Went too far. For people who don't know, the WNBA is confused. They're trying to figure out how are they going to accept transgenders into the league, and two former NBA players has just came out and said they're transgenders just to be in the league. They're trying to get that bag. So it's a lot going on. Women in the league upset. Somebody gonna be these two niggas teammates. Y'all just gonna have to accept it or change the rule.
What makes the strategy particularly effective is its ideological laziness. Rather than constructing careful arguments about how fairness can be preserved under expanded eligibility rules, or rather than commissioning transparent research into retained advantages and then publishing the findings for public scrutiny, the preferred method is to attach negative moral labels to the opposing side and then declare the matter settled. This approach conserves institutional energy while maximizing social pressure. It also allows organizations to avoid the uncomfortable possibility that their preferred policy may conflict with the interests of the majority of female athletes they claim to champion. By keeping the focus on feelings and identity rather than on performance differentials and opportunity costs, the conversation remains safely within the realm of sentiment and never has to confront the ledger of wins, losses, records, and scholarships that actually determine careers. The laziness is not accidental. It is a feature that protects the narrative from empirical challenge. Transitions between these tactics are often seamless because each element reinforces the others. The Jumbotron, which any attempt to reopen the discussion, is met with the same cycle of symbolic affirmation, moral accusation, and social pressure. Athletes who have spent years developing within the female category find themselves navigating a landscape where their lived experience of physical difference is treated as less authoritative than institutional messaging.
We may see some sort of additional definition being drawn by the WNBA and by other sports leagues, similar to the standards that we see in Olympic competition, where there's all sorts of hormone limits that are set. We have not gotten there. This may require a greater level of specificity from the WNBA.
Fans who came to the sport for the excellence of women's basketball discover that the product is increasingly entangled with cultural signaling that may or may not align with their own priorities. The league, meanwhile, can claim progress without ever having to quantify what has been gained or lost in competitive terms. The pattern extends beyond any single arena and into the broader culture of professional sports administration. Similar gestures appear in other leagues and governing bodies that face the same set of questions, and the responses tend to follow the same script of elevation, followed by stigma. The consistency suggests that the approach is not an isolated improvisation, but a preferred method for managing controversy. When the method is applied to women's sports, however, the stakes are uniquely high because the category itself exists precisely to counteract historical and biological disadvantages. Dissolving the boundaries without transparent justification risks undoing the very rationale that made the category necessary. The irony is that an organization ostensibly dedicated to elevating women's athletic achievement would choose tactics that make the defense of that achievement appear socially suspect. The defense of sex-based categories becomes the thing that requires apology rather than the thing that requires protection.
Cunningham and Caitlin Clark, and then Indiana Fever obviously is incredibly popular because of Caitlin Clark in terms of the notoriety she brings. And you have the coach wearing, she's for trans kids belong shirt. So some would argue that whereas from a legal standpoint, like you're pointing out, the league in an official capacity hasn't had to really deal with this problem, address this problem, there are individuals within the league that have taken their position that has drawn attention from the national audience out there.
Humor enters the picture when one considers the sheer predictability of the cycle. An organization faces a difficult policy question involving fairness and biology. Instead of wrestling with data, it commissions a high-visibility display that celebrates a particular group. Critics raise concerns about competitive integrity. The organization and its allies respond by questioning the critic's motives and character. Media coverage amplifies the moral framing. Public discourse shifts from, "Does this policy preserve fairness?" to, "Are you a good person if you question this policy?" Somewhere in the process, the original athletic concerns are left behind like luggage on a moving train. The absurdity lies in how thoroughly the conversation can be redirected without anyone having to produce a single performance metric that demonstrates equivalent outcomes under the new rules. The spectacle of institutional confidence combined with empirical evasiveness becomes its own form of comedy. Provided one is willing to notice, would require institutions to publish the criteria by which they determine that fairness has been preserved rather than simply asserting that inclusion is fairness by definition. Until those steps are taken, gestures like arena messaging will continue to function as substitutes for policy rather than as complements to it. The substitution is convenient for organizations that prefer the glow of cultural alignment over the friction of open debate, but it leaves the sport itself poorer for the lack of clarity.
On that same vein, in that story with ESPN, you talked about wanting to protect young girls who shouldn't have to go against biological men. Just can you expand your viewpoint on that?
I mean, I think I said what I said. I think it's kind of common sense. And I think I'll always believe in that. I think it's really important to protect children. And that's little girls who are also involved in that category. And so I stand on what I said. And
the long-term consequence of relying on emotional coercion rather than intellectual engagement is a gradual erosion of trust among the very people the league needs most, beginning with the athletes who fill the rosters and extending outward to the fans who buy the tickets and the young players who look to the professional level as a model of what excellence in women's basketball can become. When those groups repeatedly observe that difficult questions about competitive fairness and biological differences are met with moral theater instead of transparent analysis of performance data, retention of physical advantages, or the practical effects on roster spots and scholarships, they begin to suspect that the institution's priorities have drifted from the hard work of protecting competitive excellence toward the softer currency of cultural positioning. This suspicion forms slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, as each new public gesture is filed away alongside the last, until the pattern itself becomes the dominant impression left by the organization. Suspicion of that kind is difficult to reverse because it is rooted in observed institutional behavior rather than in abstract ideology or temporary media cycles. And once it takes hold, it colors every subsequent announcement, every arena display, and every carefully worded statement that follows.
Is if we are men, right, and as former athletes, and we understand how hard it is to get respect in the game, don't make a mockery of what these women are going through. Don't make jokes about things you'll never understand. Stay out of it. If you don't have some input, either right or wrong, that could be, whether it's impactful or helpful, then let them people be. Because dudes who can no longer play, who want to make jokes about something that is incredibly serious, are absolute clowns.
Once the pattern of deflection becomes familiar, each new gesture is interpreted through the lens of previous ones, so that what might once have been received as simple hospitality is now read as another calculated move in an ongoing campaign of selective affirmation. The cumulative effect is a widespread sense that the league is managing optics rather than protecting the category that gives women's basketball its distinct purpose and value. Athletes who have trained for years within the boundaries of that category start to wonder, begin to notice that the product on the court is increasingly framed by cultural signals that may or may not align with their own reasons for supporting the sport. Young players, still forming their understanding of what professional competition demands, absorb the message that institutional approval flows more readily toward symbolic alignment than toward rigorous defense of the conditions that make fair contest possible.
It's truly refreshing to see that there's still some people out here in this world that got common sense. WNBA player Sophie Cunningham said that trans women shouldn't be in women's sports. And of course, a lot of people got pissed and calling her transphobic. Wrestling fans attacked Jada Parker for liking a post of Trump banning trans women in women's sports. And of course, you got pissed off too and you calling her transphobic. Both of these women are correct. I 1,000%.
In the end, the Jumbotron messages at Barclays Center stand as a clear illustration of how an organization can choose visibility over rigor, allowing the lights to flash and the words to scroll so that the intended audience received its affirmation, while the harder questions about biological reality, competitive fairness, and the original purpose of women's categories remained unanswered and largely unexamined. That choice was not forced upon the league by external pressure or by any unavoidable legal requirement. It was selected from a range of possible responses that included open data review, athlete consultation, and clear policy articulation grounded in measurable outcomes. Selecting the more theatrical option revealed a preference for the tools of social pressure and institutional signaling over the tools of empirical examination and transparent reasoning. Whether that preference ultimately serves the long-term health of women's basketball is a question the league has so far preferred not to answer in measurable terms, leaving the sport to carry the weight of unresolved tensions that no amount of arena messaging can dissolve and that continue to shape the public conversation long after the final score is posted.